Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about colour and in particular how to mix our watercolours. I'm going to give you some exercises that I hope will enable you to build some confidence with your colour mixing. And I'll show you a way of setting out your palette so that you have some confidence and precision with your colour mixing as you progress with your watercolour painting. One of the problems that you'll find starting off as a watercolour painter is that the choice that you have of colours and pigments is very, very wide, and knowing exactly which colours you need isn't exactly straightforward. To a certain extent, a lot of it is down to personal choice, but also the subject that you paint will have an influence on that too. It's important to say at this point that you don't need to copy the exact colours that I use. I use those for a reason. I paint landscapes in the UK, predominantly in Dorset and Sussex. I have cool northern light for most of the year, and that has an impact on what the scenes look like and the colours that I use to describe that. In particular, there's a lot of grey, there's a lot of brown, there's a lot of cool blues and soft greens. That's dictated the way that I've put my palette together over the years. If you're living in the Mediterranean, for example, then you'll be using an entirely different colour palette to me. Probably strong ochres, vibrant azure blues for sea and sky, that type of thing. And that's great. There's no right or wrong with regard to the colours that you use. Pick the ones that suit you and the subjects that you want to paint. So let's get started, and the first thing that I want to show you is the importance of understanding your primary colours, your red, yellow and blue. You cannot successfully paint landscapes without a solid grasp of how to mix your three primary colours. If you stick with me to the end, and I hope you will, I will give you a walk around my palette that I use in the studio. I'll show you how that's set up, how that works for me, and I'll show you some of my go-to mixes, the colours that I mix that crop up predominantly in every single painting that I do. So here's the palette that I showed to you when we were looking at basic watercolour equipment. It's got 24 colours in it, but if I was using this myself, I would probably only be concerned with using, I don't know, half of those maybe. What I've done is I've organised this into a way that makes sense to me in terms of how I mix my colours. I've moved the blues that I want to use down to this end, and the yellows, and the reds. So I've got my three primaries here. I know where they are on the palette, and it makes it much easier for me when I come to mix my paints. I've also got some earth colours here, and there's a couple of greens there. I don't use those a lot, but I've just included those there. And this is important because as you progress with your landscape painting, you'll realise that being able to mix a colour quickly and precisely as the paint is drying is a very important skill to have. Now, what I tend to do with my primary colours is have three versions of each. This one here is French Ultramarine, or Ultramarine Blue, I think it's called in the Aquafine range. Then there's Cobalt Blue and Prussian Blue. This is warm, this is sort of neutral to cool, and this is cool. In my yellows, there's cadmium yellow here, which is again, neutral to cool as I would consider it. Gamboge, which is a warm yellow. I'm not even sure what this one is. And the same with the reds here. I've got a cadmium red, which is warm, light red, which is, it's warm, but it's earthy and it's a bit more neutral. And then there's a cool red here, rose madder. There's alizarin crimson here, which I've sort of fell out of favour with, to be honest. It's not a colour I tend to use that much anymore. But I have three different blues, three different yellows, and three different reds as my primaries. Now, when I talk about warm and cool primary colours, what exactly do I mean? Well, let's have a look at a colour chart and we should be able to work out what's going on. Here are our three primaries: blue, red, yellow. The colour wheel describes the relationship between those three primaries when they're mixed together. So starting here with our blue, the more red we mix to it, the warmer it becomes until we end up purple right into red. This way, starting with blue, the more yellow that we add to it, the cooler it becomes, going through green until we end up at yellow. So when I say ultramarine is a warm blue, it already has quite a degree of red mixed into it. When I say that Prussian blue is a cool blue, it has yellow in it. So it sits along here on the colour wheel. Now the first thing I want to show you is a very simple principle, and it's a good habit to get into with colour mixing. Very simply it's this. If I want to make a very fresh yellowy green, start off with the yellow. And I mix blue with that because we know yellow and blue make green. But if I start off with the yellow and add a little bit of blue, then I'm going to get a nice fresh yellowy green, okay? Conversely, if I want a greeny blue, I will start off my mix with the blue. And I will add in a little bit of yellow. By doing it this way, you're in control of your mixes. You're not using up endless pigment trying to arrive at the right colour. It gives you a lot more precision over what you're doing. So why is it so important to know your primaries? Why do artists go on all the time about knowing and understanding how to mix your primaries? Well, very simply, it's because I know that from just three colours, my red, yellow and blue, I can largely achieve almost any colour I want within a painting. French ultramarine is a core colour for me. There it is, it's beautiful. But I know that I can add a little bit of cadmium red into that. And it's going to take it towards a purpley colour. Or I know that if I add in some yellow ochre here, it's going to start to give me a soft olivey green. These are all colours that I will use within my landscape. I know also that if I need to modify this purpley colour here and make it a little more grey, I can just add in a little bit of the same primary colour, yellow ochre, and I'm moving this from being purple towards a grey. And if I keep going, it becomes brown. And if I add more red into that, I can get an even warmer brown. And I've achieved a range of colours here just by simply making adjustments with the three primaries that I've got. And it means that as I paint quickly, as I'm working on a landscape, and I have ultramarine, yellow ochre and cadmium red, for example, sitting on my palette, that when they're running together and I haven't quite got an eye on exactly what's going on, because you need to work fast with watercolour, I know that the colours are going to be running together and making combinations that I understand, that I've used before, that aren't suddenly going to give me a nasty shock in the middle of my painting because, my blues run into my red and I had no idea it was going to make that colour. I know what is going to happen as these colours run together. So I don't need to worry too much about it. I can concentrate on what I'm doing in my painting without having to worry too much about what's happening on the palette. And also, by concentrating on these three colours, it means I don't have to worry about what specific colour I need to pick up my paint from. Is it that one? Or was it that green? I can't really remember. No, I just can add a little bit more of each primary to arrive at where I want. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you the range of colours that you can achieve by mixing your primaries together. We're going to have a look at using a warm set of primaries, and we're going to have a look at using a cooler set of primaries. So for the first exercise, let's get a piece of paper and mix three primaries together, and we're going to mix three warm primaries. Let's start off with French Ultramarine. Everything starts with French Ultramarine. So would you like to have coffee or tea with your breakfast? Well, ideally, if you've got some French Ultramarine, that'd be lovely, thank you. Right, here we go. Lovely warm blue. And now what I want you to do is get a warm yellow and gradually mix it into here. So this is gamboge. You can see just a small amount of yellow cools this down immediately. As you're working down the paper like this, just add a little bit more water once in a while because you're adding pigment here and the mix is getting a lot thicker and you want to keep it all a similar kind of tonal range. Now you can see we're heading towards a nice bright green colour. Then we're going to add some cadmium red, a nice warm red. Be careful with that, not too much at once because it's quite a strong pigment. And let's just jump across here and start heading back up the page. Now look, we've turned the corner here and our greens are becoming browns. And that's a combination of the yellow, the red and the blue. Keep working up the paper, adding some more cadmium red. A little bit more water, a little bit more red. And let's go back and add a little bit more blue in again. And come across and start heading back down again. A little bit at a time. That's quite enough. And look, we've gone from ultramarine, we've added in gamboge, cools it down, it becomes green, we've added in a bit of cadmium red, it starts warming that green up and it becomes a nice brown colour. The more red we keep adding to the mix, we go into oranges, into reds, and then adding some blue back in again turns those reds into this nice brick red colour almost, and now we start moving through purples and all the way back to blue. And the issue here is we've used three colours in our palette: ultramarine, gamboge, cadmium red, and I've got, I think there's about 30 colours here. Now, they all have a sense of unity to them because they come from the same three primaries. Not only does that help when we come to paint and it gives our paintings a nice sense of unity, but it's just so much easier to find the colours that you need from understanding how they mix together, just your three primaries. Otherwise, you've got to have 30 separate pans on your palette, and you've got to remember the difference between that one and that one. Well, good luck with that. That's not quite so easy. Then let's do the same thing using three cool primaries. So I'm going to use Prussian Blue, Lemon Yellow, and Rose Madder. Okay, let's start with some Prussian Blue. I'm tempted to start with Ultramarine, but of course that would spoil the plan somewhat. There we are. I'm not going to do as many mixes here. You get the idea. And I'll just show you the difference between the cool and the warm. You can see this is cooler already, going with quite a bit more yellow. Gorgeous colour this, as we're going into this sort of turquoisey, greeny hue here. Totally different to what we get from the warm colours. That the blue's got more red in it, and so we get a more earthy type of green. Here it's a lot fresher. Great when you're painting spring scenes, for example. Let's just add a little bit more yellow in there. And then warm that up with some red. And we've got this sort of sludgy greeny brown. Sounds terrible, but actually it's quite nice. I quite like that colour. And this is what you get from doing this. You'd start discovering nice combinations. Let's just go back to the Prussian Blue now. Put too much in there. You have to be careful with Prussian Blue. It's an incredibly fierce pigment. It's very easy to pick too much up on the brush, even using pans. But look, there we are. So you can see we've got an entirely different range of colours here. We're not going to get these bright reds and oranges that we get from having our warm red. The Rose Madder is a lot cooler, the yellow's cooler, the blue's cooler, and that just gives a different range of opportunities when we mix these together. And so we've got a whole bunch of other colours here as well. And again, we've just used three pigments on our palette. Now play around with this, mix up the primaries. So you could have a warm blue and a cool yellow and a warm red, and it doesn't really matter which combination you want to use. Keep playing around like this and you'll find that there's an almost endless range of colours that you can mix from your three primaries, and knowing what those results are is very, very helpful to you. Now, the second exercise that I would recommend is to introduce some of your earth colours. So what I'm going to do here is pick up some burnt sienna. It's a beautiful colour, orange in many ways, but a reddy brown as well, if you like. And let's just start over here with some burnt sienna. I'm going to mix into that a little bit of ultramarine. Let's see, immediately it's a little bit cooler as I add the blue to it. We've still got a lovely brown here. It's a different, cooler brown. The more blue we add, the more we move from brown through to a grey colour. And it makes a fantastic grey. And if you keep going and make a very dark mix of burnt sienna and ultramarine, then it's a lovely dark that you can use in your paintings without having to use black, which has an ability to deaden and kill the scene that you're painting. Now let's do the same thing, but use a cool blue instead. So start with your burnt sienna and mix in some Prussian blue. You can see it's a cooler brown. We have too much Prussian blue. It's back to where it should be. Now what's interesting, and it's totally different to what we've got on the left-hand side here, you can see that as I put a bit more blue in, this is not really staying brown, it's becoming green. And that's because burnt sienna has quite a lot of yellow in it. Prussian blue has quite a lot of yellow in it. And as we mix the two together, we end up with green as opposed to grey. Two blues, two earth colours that are the same, entirely different outcomes. And then carry on this exercise, but instead of using burnt sienna, use burnt umber, for example, or raw umber, or yellow ochre, or Payne's grey. Keep playing around with these mixes, and you'll start to build up a lot of knowledge with regard to colour and how they can work for you and how to mix them quickly and precisely. Keep your sheets too, make notes on them. They're useful reference points, and you can look back on them and think, yeah, I remember making a really nice soft grey, and oh yeah, it was that one, I can see it was burnt sienna and ultramarine. Very, very useful information. And you've done this, you've practiced it. And while you were doing it, not only were you understanding the way the colours mix together, but by default you are becoming more familiar with where the paints are on your palette. Your mixing skills are becoming better. You're working little brush strokes too at the same time. It's just a good all-round exercise to do. And it's an awful lot of fun. Another good exercise to do is make these colour charts. And what I've done here is I've selected some blues. They're not necessarily the same blues that I had in the palette. They're not necessarily the blues that I always use, but they serve a useful purpose for this illustration. So the blues on my palette, French Ultramarine, Cobalt Blue, Cerulean. I've added Payne's grey in. It's a sort of neutral colour, and I sort of lump it into the term of earth colours, but it's got quite a lot of blue in it, so I've put it here as well. And then along the top, I've got 3 yellows, 3 reds, and 3 other earth colours. And simply mix each one and put it in the box. French Ultramarine, Cadmium Yellow, put it in there. French Ultramarine, Naples Yellow, put it in there. And you start to see the range of colours that becomes available to you from a limited number of pigments on your palette. Then do the same thing with yellows. So raw sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, Naples yellow down there. 3 reds, 3 blues, 3 earth colours along the top. And have a look at the colours that you get from doing that. Same again with red. Now I've had a number of requests asking me if I can make these available as downloads. Well, yes, I can, but I'm not going to because it's all a bit too easy. If you make these yourself, then you will learn far more about the way the paints behave, the way they mix, because you're doing it for yourself. Just by me telling you or having the downloads from something that I've done, you will learn a fraction of what you could learn from actually having a go. Now what you will see from these charts is that there is a tremendous range of colours available just from mixing a few primaries and a few earth colours together. And it means that you don't have to buy the endless different colours that manufacturers' marketing teams suggest that you need to buy. That does not lead to better painting, it just leads to confusion. Let me just show you quickly how a limited palette can be so beneficial to you when you're painting in watercolour. When I say limited, of course, I mean limited to the number of pigments that I have on here, not to the amount of space I have to mix them. I'm going to imagine I'm painting a rocky ledge, and I'll show you this in a painting that I did a while ago, just to demonstrate a little further. Let's start off with French Ultramarine. It's just pretty much the way every painting starts for me. And into that I can mix some cadmium red. Straight away on this side of the palette I've got a nice shadow colour here. And then on this side of the palette, I'll pick up some burnt sienna and mix that in. I've got a nice brown starting here. And I'm not bothered about these two running and clashing on my palette because they're going to as I put them down on the paper. So I can be painting, let's imagine the ledge is running across here. And what I don't want is it all to look the same. So these are running together on the palette. They're running together as I paint them on the paper. I can add into this whatever I want. Let's have a little bit more burnt sienna just to warm it up here. Perhaps we need to go darker with the shadow colour. So I can drop some more blue and red in here. Paint on this side. Perhaps maybe we've got seaweed green in here too, so let's hint at that. And each time I go back to the paper, I've got a slightly different version of these colours mixing themselves together on the palette. I'm just helping them to come together and putting them down here. Let's introduce another colour. Let's put some of this lovely madder, brown madder into here, just to warm that up too. And I know what these colours do when they run together. I know that I'm not going to get any nasty surprises. Whereas if I'm having to choose from, I don't know, 15, 20 different browns and greys and greens, I'm slowing my whole process down. It's becoming rather difficult to paint, and you find that areas like this start to dry up on you. I can get away with it here because I know what these colours are going to do as they run together. I'm used to using these. And because there's only a few of them, I've mastered how they run together. So knowing your colours, understanding how they interact on the palette when you're not watching, that's so important. It allows you to work in this quick, dynamic way, and that gives you so much more flexibility with your watercolour painting. Now here's the painting that I mentioned to you earlier. It's of Kimmeridge Bay in Dorset. It's one of my favourite paintings. There's just something I liked about the way that the sea's rolling in, the movement in the sky, and the composition of this prominent shale ledge in the foreground. But it presented me with quite a few problems because the ledge is just predominantly brown, and I thought, oh, I don't really want to make a brown painting. But it is brown in colour, and so we've got to find a way of dealing with it. Now, the more I looked at the scene, the more I realised that, yes, it's brown, but there's a tremendous amount of different colours in here. Warm browns, cooler browns, some greys, almost some reds in there as well. And I thought it's important that I try and capture that. Now, there's two ways of doing it. Arrive at those colours from the colours that I have on my palette, or buy a whole range of different colours and use those. I'm just going to zoom in on this a little bit so you can see a little bit more detail. There we are. Up here, now I've started off with a raw sienna, some burnt sienna in there to give it a bit of warmth. As we come across here, I've got my shadow mix of ultramarine and cadmium red in here. I can see that. Up there's probably a bit of burnt umber. And as we come down through this area here, I've got a bit more blue in here that's giving it a slight green tint there. I've dropped in some red here. That's a bit more cadmium red with a little bit of, probably a little bit of burnt umber in there as well. A lot more burnt umber as I come down into this area down here, and then we're back to this nice red shadow color, a lot more raw sienna and burnt sienna mixed in here to give this color. And I counted it up, and to be perfectly honest, if I wanted to buy all the colours to do this, it's somewhere between 10 to 15 browns and greys. Well, that becomes rather expensive, and it becomes rather difficult because you then have got to make sure that they all seem to tie into each other. They may not. I know, though, working from the three primaries that I'm using, raw sienna, cadmium red and French ultramarine, and introducing just a couple of earth colours, I can get this wonderful array of browns and greys that are very subtle. They're all linked to each other. None of these are really jumping off the page at me, but they're giving the painting a sense of harmony, and they're giving the area of brown ledge a lot of visual interest. There's a similar thing going on in the sea area too. You could say that the sea is sort of blue. Well, it's more grey, to be honest. It's French ultramarine with a little bit of raw sienna in it just to cool it right down. More raw sienna here just as the light is catching the top of that wave. Cadmium red mixed in for this warm grey to provide some shadow underneath the waves. And then as we move towards the left of the painting and we have this large shadow on the cloud, it becomes a bit warmer in this reflected area where the tide's coming in, and you've got this nice rock pool here. And I'm mixing these from three colours, and I know what those three colours are going to do, and it enables me to give this sense of harmony across the painting. So I said I'd give you a quick tour around my palette, show you how I've got that set up. How you set your palette up is important. You need to make sure that your paints are in a familiar place so that you can access them quickly to mix the colours that you need. That enables you to respond with accuracy and precision as your painting and the washes in your painting are starting to dry. I showed you how I'd arranged the colours here. I've got a far more limited palette here, just 12 colours. I take this one out when I'm sketching, working on location. It's got everything I need here to mix the colours that I want. 3 blues, 3 reds, 3 yellows, and then just 3 earth colours there. That's more than enough for me when I'm working on location. And I know where they are, they're all in the same place, and I can mix my colours quickly and easily. In my big studio palette here, I've got a couple more colours, and they are what I've referred to previously as being local colours. But the way that I tend to operate with this is that in this area here, by and large, I will mix my blues and my greens, and in this area here, I will mix my greys and my browns, and that's the range of colours that I find in almost all the landscapes that I paint. And it's all the same colours here, and again, I know where these are, almost without having to look. I know that by putting my brush in certain places, I'm going to be able to quickly find the paint that I need. I want to show you a few of the mixes that I rely on in the vast majority of the paintings that I do. They're my go-to mixes, if you like. And I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list of these, but just show you one or two examples. A shadow colour. This comes up all the time. It's a warm grey, and I make that from ultramarine and cadmium red. There it is. Beautiful colour. If I need it to be a little bit more neutral, I can do that by adding in a little bit of yellow, a little bit of raw sienna, just to make it a little grayer. Or if it needs to be warmer, we just go back to cadmium red and warm it up again. And that's my shadow colour mix. Very, very useful. Another nice warm grey that I like is Cobalt Blue, so it's a cooler blue to start with. But I like to mix that with light red, this earthy red here on the palette. It makes a beautiful warm grey, and it granulates quite nicely as well, which I don't always need or always want in my paintings, but on certain things it's helpful. Pathways, rocks, tree bark, that sort of texture, it can be very, very useful. Again, adding a little bit more light red takes it towards brown, adding a little bit more cobalt blue brings it back to a cooler hue there. It's also useful for skies. Cobalt and light red allows me to get sunlit areas, blue skies, but also these nice warm shadows that you often get on the underside of clouds. That's another good mix to have in your locker. My go-to green is often raw sienna. It's a nice, bright, earthy yellow. I say that. The Daler Rowney one is. Some manufacturers, you'll find that their raw sienna is actually quite brown, and you'll struggle to make nice greens with this. But Ultramarine and raw sienna, it's a good green. You can get a nice richness to it like that. The more yellow that you add, of course, the more vibrant and sunlight it becomes. It's a great colour. Again, more blue. Becomes cooler, more distant. So that's a good mix to have. Raw sienna, well, particularly the Daler Rowney one, and French ultramarine gives you a lovely range of greens there. Okay, burnt sienna and raw sienna. That's a lovely warm orange, great for the sunlit side of trees, for example, or buildings catching late evening sun. Beautiful. One of my other earth colours, which I love using, is this rich burnt umber. It's a beautiful colour, a lot cooler than burnt sienna. But when I mix some ultramarine into there, I've got a nice dark brown, so the shadow side of the tree. And again, it's an easy way to find a nice, rich, deep brown. Okay, let me show you one or two of the local colours that I use. One in particular is Permanent Violet Blue. I never use it out of the tube just like this, but it's a useful base for painting heather. And I like painting heather on the heathland areas that I find in Sussex and Dorset. It's difficult to mix from the other primaries that I use, but with that as a base and a little bit of permanent rose, just to warm it up a touch, it actually creates a rather nice colour that is reasonably accurate for heather. I can go more pink if I need to. That's probably closer to it, to be honest. Yeah. So it's a useful colour for that. I also use it for Bluebells, a Sussex woodland flower. And again, they are quite difficult to get absolutely spot on. And a little bit of cobalt blue with that gives it pretty much the colour I'm looking for. It just needs a bit more blue there. Yeah, that's more like it. And that's a nice, accurate colour for Bluebells. So it's useful to have in the palette, but it doesn't get used very often. Now, neutral tint is an interesting pigment, and it's here, and it's neutral. What that means is I can create a darker version of a colour without changing its colour temperature at all. So let's use this Bluebell wash. By mixing that together, what I get here is just a darker version of this without any changing colour temperature. It's not warmer, it's not cooler. It's the same colour, it's just darker. Again, I don't use it that often, but it is a useful pigment to have if you need to achieve a darker version of something within your painting. Naples Yellow is a great colour to have on the palette. It's quite opaque, so you have to be careful with it. It will look a bit chalky sometimes if you paint it or glaze it over the top of other colours. But it's a beautiful colour for contre-jour scenes where you're looking into the light. And I often use this in skies as a first wash. That colour, it's a sort of dusky yellow towards the bottom of the sky, is superb. And then when I take some permanent rose and some cobalt blue and mix that all together, you can get wonderful soft greys that I can then drop in as clouds. That's quite warm, but it's beautiful. I can add in some more cobalt blue if I want a slightly cooler area of cloud in the sky. And it's soft and it's delicate and it's subtle, and it's what watercolour is all about for me. Doesn't come out often. I don't tend to use this for mixing greens or areas in the painting that involve any sort of overpainting, but it's a beautiful colour to have for skies and first washes. Just one more mix that I use regularly, often in middle distance or background areas where I want cool but dark tree mixes. I use Payne's Grey as the base, and then I'll add in some cadmium yellow, and it gives me a rather nice dull, cool, distant green, and it holds its position very well when I'm dropping this wet into wet for soft edged shapes in the background. And it's nice, it's not warm, but you can see that it's green without it jumping too far forward in the painting. So they're my main mixes. You'll have seen that there's some green in the corner here. That's Hooker's Green, number 2, so the darker version of Hooker's Green. I very rarely use pre-mixed greens, and this is why you won't often see a field or a tree that is this colour green. And so using pre-mixed greens can be a real killer in your painting. However, it can be nicely modified with other earth colours. So if I go into that with some burnt sienna, it actually makes a rather nice green, and it's got a lot of punch to it. And that can be important in watercolour, because mixing greens that have depth and body to them is not necessarily straightforward. And Hooker's Green in combination with your earth colours works very well. It works nicely too with this colour here, which is Brown Madder Alizarin. And when I mix that together, again, I can get a rich, dark green that's quite warm. It's a nice colour, but I don't use it often. It's there if I need to go there. It's useful to have, but to be perfectly honest, if you can arrive at your greens by mixing your yellows or your blues or some of your earth colours, that's a far better place to be. Now there's just one more thing I wanted to show you, and it's these areas that I have on my palette, and it can equally be, you know, this area up here on your palette, same here, but I have these wells reserved for what I call a sticky mix, and I tend to have 3 colours usually on the go. One is a very dark brown, one is a dark shadow colour, and one is a dark green. And the way that I make those is I'll get a lot of burnt umber. It's pretty much as it is out of the tube there. And then I'll pick up some ultramarine, and it's almost out of the tube consistency. And I'll mix this up before I do a painting, of course, only if I'm going to need it. And then it's there, it's on my palette if I need to make a dark nice and quickly to drop into an area, for example, like that. And I don't have to worry about mixing it on the go. I've got it there. But I like to have a shadow colour as well, so drop plenty of ultramarine in there. Plenty of cadmium red. Some of these have dried up a bit, but I tend to squeeze fresh paint on each time I start a new painting. But there's a deep shadow colour too that I can paint in if I need to darken areas like that. And it's good to have a variety, because when you're painting darks, if you paint the same dark all the time, it just starts to look a bit leaden and heavy, and which is why you should avoid using pre-mixed blacks. Far better to do it this way. And then the last one that I'll do is a dark green. Again, that tends to be Payne's grey as the base. And I like to use a little bit of yellow ochre with that. And that gives me a lovely dark green if I need to use that. And again, these are generally for small areas of the painting where I'm just wanting to drop in some darker accents into a wash. Very, very useful to have. And my dark brown, my dark shadow, and my dark green, they're generally always there, and I generally use them in all of my paintings. Well, thanks very much for watching. I really hope you found that helpful. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. That really helps. Also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please click on that subscribe button, and there's a little bell next to it. If you click on that, then you'll get a notification every time I post a new video. But most importantly, have a go at those exercises. Make some paint charts. Play around with the pigments that you've got, or new pigments that you might want to try out, and you'll start to understand how they combine, how they mix together. And when you come to make a painting, you're not going to be so flustered and hamstrung by the fact that you can't find the right colour to paint what you want to paint. You can approach what you're doing with some confidence and precision. And for painting landscapes in watercolour, that is an invaluable skill to have. So when I see you next time, I'm going to do a simple landscape painting, and in that I will start to tie together some of the things that we've looked at in this little series of tutorials or videos for beginners. We'll look at the way that watercolour behaves, its transparency, its unpredictability. I'll be using the equipment that I've introduced to you. We'll be looking at the different types of washes that can be made, and you'll see me using those in the context of a painting. And of course, colour mixing too. You will see real life example of how I use my primaries, my earth colours in particular, to create a painting that has a sense of unity from using a limited palette. So thanks very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.